Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, is a city of great buildings and famous and influential individuals. But Washington is also a city of ordinary people and home today to many religious and ethnic groups. Washington's first Jewish residents brought a highly developed religious and cultural tradition to a new country and an even newer city. Their story is one of religious continuity and historical change, and how traditional patterns of Jewish community life developed in the special environment of the nation's capital. Isaac Pollock, believed to be the first Jew in Washington, placed this ad in a local paper in 1800. The German-born merchant from Savannah, Georgia, built a street of 6 houses, home of the first Navy and State Departments. The city grew slowly around the President's house, the Capitol building, and the Navy Yard. By 1850, the Washington Monument was under construction. Congressional sessions were lengthened because of the increasing volume of government business. More merchants and tradesmen came to Washington, including some Jews. They settled around 7th and D Streets and in Georgetown, and established family businesses. Soon they were ready to start a synagogue and purchase land for a cemetery. But by statute, the federal city could sell property only to trustees of Christian congregations. Naval Captain Jonah Levy, a hero of the Mexican War, led Washington's Jews in petitioning the federal Congress for equal recognition, and in 1856, an act was passed by the House and Senate extending all the rights and privileges and immunities of Christian congregations to Washington's Hebrew congregation. The act was immediately signed into law by President Franklin Pierce. The Washington Hebrew congregation purchased land for a cemetery even before building a synagogue. The names on the tombstones tell a story of diverse national origins and continuity of religious identity. German names predominate: Nordlinger, Heckinger, Weil. There are Sephardic names like Luvis, and Russian names like Shmulevitz. Here lie rabbis and their wives, community leaders, and Civil War veterans such as Sergeant Leopold Karpelus, who recovered from war wounds in a Washington infirmary and later settled in the capital. In Washington, Adolphus Solomons, the official printer to the Union and unofficial spokesman for Jewish causes, was a frequent visitor to the White House. He told of a humorous encounter which occurred one Saturday morning during the Civil War. Rabbi Morris Rafal had come to Washington to ask for a military promotion for his son. President Lincoln asked him, "Is it not your first duty today to be at home to pray with your people for the success of our arms?" Blushing, the rabbi answered, "My assistant is doing that duty." "Ah," said Lincoln, "that is different." The president wrote the promotion order on a small card, and, handing it to the rabbi, he said with a wry smile, "Now, Rabbi, you can go home and do your own praying." But other meetings were more serious. In 1862, General Ulysses S. Grant issued a military order expelling Jews as a class from the Department of the Tennessee because of suspected profiteering. Adolphus Solomons and other Jews protested. The order was revoked by President Lincoln in 1863. More Jews came to Washington after the Civil War. Max Weil, a German-born watchmaker, painted landscapes of local Washington scenery, landscapes which would later hang in the Corcoran Gallery of Art. Edward Hartogenesis, a Dutch Jew who opened a dry goods shop in the 1870s. And Bernard Nordlinger, a Confederate veteran who settled in Georgetown. Young couples were married. Children were born. By 1880, there were 3,000 Jews in Washington. Some of their stores were downtown landmarks, while others, more modest, reflected the economic and social status of most of the Jewish community. The Washington Hebrew congregation purchased an unfinished Methodist Episcopal church at 8th and I Streets Northwest. Soon, English replaced German as the main language of prayer, and women who once sat separately in the balcony now sat downstairs with husbands and sons. Finally, an organ was brought into the synagogue. Reform had come to Washington. There was angry resistance. 35 members of the congregation resigned in protest and founded the Orthodox Adas Israel Synagogue. The Ark for the Torah was added to the outside of the building, imitating synagogue architecture popular in 19th century Germany, a conscious reminder of the founder's origins. Adolphus Solomons was a guest at the dedication in 1876, as was Simon Wolfe, the recorder of deeds for the District of Columbia. Wolfe had defended General Grant against charges of anti-Semitism during the Civil War. In a special gesture of friendship to Simon Wolfe, President Grant attended the dedication of the new synagogue. Ironically, neither Simon Wolfe nor Adolphus Solomons belonged to the synagogue whose dedication they celebrated. Adolphus Solomons prayed at home according to the Sephardic ritual, while Simon Wolfe was a member of the Reform Washington Hebrew congregation. During the following years, Adolphus Solomons was a founder of the American Red Cross and the Washington Humane Society, and Simon Wolfe became a champion of liberal social causes and an advisor to presidents. Of the millions of East European Jews who emigrated to America after 1881, only a few thousand came to Washington, a small but growing city which was not an industrial or manufacturing center, but which offered opportunities for merchants, tradesmen, and shopkeepers. Children and parents went to settlement houses such as Barney House to learn the language and customs of their new home. Their small, crowded stores could be found in the downtown area, in Southwest and Northeast Washington, and in Georgetown. New synagogues, such as Ohev Shalom at 5th and I Streets Northwest, and Kesher Israel in Georgetown, reflected the social origins and religious practices of the newest Washingtonians. In the absence of a local Yiddish theater, the newcomers crowded Washington's movie houses. In the absence of a local Yiddish press, they gathered in stores like this to read Yiddish newspapers published in other cities and to speak Mamaloshen, their mother tongue. The more assimilated German Jews did not live on the same streets as the newcomers, nor did they attend the same synagogues. The new arrivals found a friend in Aunt Minnie, Minnie Landsberg Goldsmith, from one of Washington's most prominent German Jewish families. Aunt Minnie's relief work with Russian Jews was based on the notion of community self-help, and she encouraged the immigrants to assume leadership roles in the charitable organizations which she helped to establish. In this very southern city, an even greater social barrier divided blacks from whites. Blacks were the invisible Washingtonians, and separate did not mean equal in the nation's capital. To most Washington Jews, like to most whites, racial segregation was a fact of life. But some Washington Jews actively opposed racial discrimination. One form of discrimination against both blacks and Jews was the real estate covenant, such as this one from the 1930s. It obligated the homeowner not to sell or rent his house to Negroes and Jews. Excluded from Christian-sponsored YMCAs, fraternities, sororities, and country clubs, Washington's Jews created their own institutions, such as the Young Men's Hebrew Association. In 1925, President and Mrs. Coolidge attended the groundbreaking ceremony for a Jewish community center at 16th and Q Streets Northwest. The president voiced his hope that those who come and go shall gaze upon this civic and social landmark and be reminded of the inspiring service that has been rendered to civilization by men and women of the Jewish faith. Jews flocked to the JCC from all over the city. They socialized among themselves, largely separate from non-Jews. But in the city's public schools, the Jewish boys drilled with their Christian classmates in the high school cadet corps. The cadets were a unique Washington institution, established by an act of Congress in 1907. They marched in every presidential inauguration from Taft to Eisenhower to the stirring cadences of one of John Philip Sousa's most popular marches, composed expressly for them. Captain Robert I. Silverman and Major Aaron Goldman were high school cadets in the 1920s and 30s.
If you were not a great athlete, the cadets were the place to be.
Well, you can also just imagine how proud parents were of their sons. Here's a boy that comes home and he gets promoted from private to corporal. He's got 6 kids that he's going to train. And then he gets promoted to sergeant. They were cavelling just like their sons were. They were so proud of their sons.
But how did immigrant Jewish parents feel about seeing their sons marching in uniform and carrying guns?
There was a niggling kind of a fear that their boy was getting associated with a military or quasi-military organization. And many Jewish families were in this country and were in Washington because they didn't want to belong to the Tsar's army. And the idea of their son belonging to something that uniforms and guns, I can't say they relished it.
The highlight of the cadets' year was the annual drill competition at Griffith Stadium, home of the Washington Senators. Captain Silverman relives a special day in 1928.
We won the drill. Captain Israel Silverman. There had been only one Jewish boy before me who was ever the captain of a winning company.
The judges made their decision, and the winning company was informed through the cadets' own chain of command. The captain of the winning company received the coveted Allison Naylor Medal on behalf of his men. The high school cadets taught the children of immigrants an important lesson.
It taught us how to get along with people in this great America.
2 years after Company E won the annual drill competition, many of those former cadets were looking for work in the midst of the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover's economic policies were rejected by the American voters, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's inauguration in March 1933 signaled a new hope for the country and the local economy as well. Sidney Heckinger was a local businessman who later founded the Heckinger chain of home improvement centers. His daughter recalls that her father's company built the reviewing stand for FDR's inauguration.
For Roosevelt's inauguration in 1933, he was a successful bidder for putting up the stands and tearing them down. He also built the platform on which Franklin Roosevelt took his oath of office and made his famous "We have nothing to fear but fear itself" speech.
This nation is asking for action, and action now.
FDR's call for a war on the Depression required an army. More than any previous president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt opened his administration to Jews. Professor Felix Frankfurter of the Harvard Law School was a frequent visitor to Washington during the New Deal. Some of his brightest students came to Washington to work for the country's recovery. Students like Joseph Rao.
I'm one of those lucky people who was known in the New Deal as a happy hot dog. In my last year at law school, 34 to 35, Professor Frankfurter took a shine to me and sent me down here. But I'm clearly a Frankfurter product.
Washingtonians felt the Depression keenly. Some Jewish New Dealers fought more than the Depression. In 1939, the Daughters of the American Revolution refused to allow Marian Anderson to sing at Constitution Hall. But First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and Interior Secretary Harold Ickes found an alternative location, the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Joseph Rao attended the concert out of a deep commitment to social justice.
My wife and I went out that day, and we will never, never, never forget that beauty. It was the beauty of her on the steps singing, but there was something even more beautiful, and that was the audience. The audience was the black community of Washington dressed up, and this was the most beautiful looking audience I have ever seen at a time when blacks were still totally discriminated against. It was just exciting.
But even as some Jewish New Dealers worried about racial discrimination at home, Hitler's war against the Jews of Europe was escalating. Only later did the world learn of the European Holocaust. Meanwhile, more Jews came to Washington to help in the war effort and joined an exodus to the suburbs which gained momentum after the war. Stores such as Posen's Meat Market and Bakery followed their customers to the new neighborhoods.
Jews were generally moving north into Maryland. And when we moved in here, most of the Jewish population uptown lived on 9th Street, 7th Street, and so forth, pretty close to here. And it was a place to attract Jewish customers.
The downtown congregations moved to spacious new buildings away from the old neighborhoods. The original Adas Israel Synagogue at 6th and G Streets Northwest became a carry-out food store that featured pork. The building was almost torn down to make way for the new metro, but the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Washington saved the building. Today, the original Adas Israel Synagogue is the Lillian and Albert Small Jewish Museum of Washington, a homey and evocative reminder of an earlier age when almost all of Washington's Jews lived and worked and prayed within sight of the Capitol. From before the Civil War until World War II, Jews were a distinctive, if small, part of this city's population. Here, community leaders brought local concerns to congressmen and presidents. The sons of immigrants became leaders of the high school cadet corps, and the targets of European bigotry joined the battle against racial and religious discrimination. In this special environment, traditional patterns of Jewish community life continued as usual, even as they were modified by the American experience. In Washington, this unique city, the Jews became a capital community.